Hello, I'm Ciaran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc sheep podcast. Each episode we bring latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this episode we switch to our grazing management focus. I'm joined by Dr. Philip Creighton to discuss grazing management for the coming weeks. Phil starts off by offering his tips on dealing with heavy covers, and we discuss why it's important not to delay removing surpluses and get them back into the rotation in time to be used before mating. It's also important at the moment to take stock of current grass demand on the farm and where it's likely to be for the coming weeks. We tease this issue out a little bit more. We finish up by discussing the importance of building covers into the autumn, planning the final round of fertilizer and setting up the rotation for the coming weeks. We start off, however, with Philip discussing the current situation around the country, grass growth rates, dry matters and current grazing management practice.
Grass growth has actually been fairly strong over the last month or 6 weeks. Growth rates anywhere between 60 to 70 kilos of grass dry matter per hectare per day, I suppose. But there has been challenges, depending, well, I think everywhere in the country obviously has got a lot of rain in July. Anywhere from 150 to 200% of normal rainfall seems to have fallen across the country. So while grass growth has been strong, dry matter of that grass has dropped a good bit. Dry matters here in Athenry running probably 12 or 13% dry matter, where normally that would be up around the 15 to 16%. So that is having an impact there in terms of land performance, the actual feed value of the grass during those really wet conditions, which has to be taken into account. And also I suppose that utilization levels are causing issues in some parts. But in general, I suppose, as we say, growth has been strong. Days ahead is variable, and probably some of that to do with where you are in the country as well. So drier parts of the country where maybe they needed the rain, days ahead kind of still on the lowish side, whereas in other parts, the days ahead was already high, and probably has increased with the increase in grass growth.
It's probably a reflection, Phil, of the fact that a lot of them places were coming out of drought. There was still silage to be dropped out. We see lower covers, but as you said, it's really has powered on with that growth in other areas. But just utilization is probably as big an issue now as anything, particularly in the last 2 weeks.
The last 2 weeks, really, I suppose, utilization has become a big issue for some parts of the country. You're dealing with heavier covers than normal, maybe because of the good growth rates that we've experienced. And I suppose there's a couple of different scenarios. There's scenarios where people, have a high days ahead figure and really need to do something to reset that. And by high, I suppose we're heading up for around 30 days ahead at the moment. We'd be saying we should be approaching maybe 20. So if that's the case, people that are up around 30 days ahead really have to try and take out, the strongest of the covers, as surplus silage or whatever. But having said that, it's try and get moving on that as soon as possible. Thankfully, for a lot of the country this week, conditions look reasonably favourable for doing that, and hasn't been up to now, which was another issue, and that surpluses were developing, but it was just too wet to be able to be able to do anything about it.
There was little control option, but as you mentioned here about taking out surpluses, there is maybe a tendency still in some cases to let them bulk on. I think not alone from a weather point of view, but just even for getting that back into the rotation, them surpluses really need to come out earlier in August, maybe than early to mid-August at the latest.
Yeah, really, surpluses, we should be finished making silage by the middle of August, really at the latest, so that we can get that ground back in, and growing to start building covers for the autumn and the winter. There is that tendency to let things bulk up and go on. Really not a great idea at any time of the year, because you're going to suffer in terms of quality, but definitely at this time of year, it's going to cause issues in that you may end up with a lot of surplus silage in the yard and not a whole lot of grass available for grazing. as we move into, September, October, when we really need grass there for finishing lambs and for ewes heading for mating and to carry them into the winter.
It's when you add on that 3 weeks or 3.5, maybe 4 weeks that's back in, and declining growth rates, it does sometimes put the system under pressure. The other aspect, maybe, Phil, of dealing with them heavier covers, aside from dropping out surplus where that's applicable and where it's possible, maybe even with conditions, grazing them heavier covers, what strategies can you employ?
Yeah, so the other strategies, I suppose, where maybe people have done a fodder budget and they've said, look, we have enough silage, or they don't want to make more silage. It's really about maybe trying to ration out that grass or divide it out with temporary fencing or whatever to try and utilize it as best as possible. Obviously, the bigger the area that a group of sheep gets in these higher covers, if it's not divided up, utilization will be very poor. They'll walk a lot of it into the ground, and the issue with that, I suppose, is that we really have to be looking forward now into September, October time, when if we don't get good clean outs on swards now, it's going to be practically impossible to clean them out to a good residual in September and October when we start closing off fields for early spring grazing. So it's August, but we're already having to start thinking about what grass we're going to have next March and April. So it's about rationing it out, letting lambs into grass first, let them get the best of it, and then maybe strip grazing ewes to graze it out as best you can.
Group size at this stage, look, we've rams and ewe lambs split. We're often there could be finishing groups or later groups of lambs on the farm. It just possibly puts a little bit of, I'm doubling up on pressure, but it does put a bit of pressure on getting the appropriate grazing pressure on paddocks at this stage. So the option maybe just of grouping some of that stock up, putting ewes in with lambs again, should it be considered for some?
Yeah, well, I suppose definitely, if you go through your ewes at this stage, and pick out, the ewes that really would benefit from a bit more preferential treatment, maybe they could be put in with lambs on better grass. It increases the group size, so increases the grazing pressure, and maybe you'll get through areas that bit quicker. Absolutely, the more grazing groups there are on the farm, the more difficult it's going to be to maintain a grazing rotation or to graze out fields sufficiently that quality is going to be there for the autumn. So anything that can be done from that point of view is going to be beneficial.
I'm just thinking, Phil, at this time of the year, another challenge that often crops up is assessing maybe where the lambs are on the farm or how many are being carried into the back end, maybe to avoid getting a shock. Sometimes when we have good grass growth rates, we potentially get a little bit complacent in the amount of animals that's being carried or putting plans in place to carry them.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a big issue this year, well, potentially a big issue in that, again, depending on how difficult things have been as regards rainfall. I mentioned, dry matter of grass was falling as the rainfall levels increased. That may have had a knock-on effect in terms of the drafting pattern, the number of lambs that were coming fit, particularly again over the last couple of weeks. We would have seen it here in terms of our lamb performance, and our lamb drafting pattern was actually ahead of schedule up to about 3 weeks ago. And then as the really, high levels of rain kept falling consistently, we have seen lamb performance start to fall off. And we're probably at a situation now where we're, in terms of lambs drafted, we're pretty much where we'd normally be, but the concern would be what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks. And as you say, if we were to fall behind in terms of the number of lambs moved, that would put extra pressure then on terms of feed availability as we move into late August and early September. So it'd be important to keep an eye on not just what grass is available, but the number of animals that's going to be there grazing that, requiring feed. So strategies there, depending on what feed availability is there at the moment, particularly the people maybe that are down at a lower days ahead figure. So there is some farms we're seeing on pasture base where they're maybe only down at 10 or 12 days ahead. Even with good growth rates. Maybe it's a thing of assessing. Maybe has enough fertilizer gone out? Is there other issues at play?
To put that in context, where do you want them to be at for the end of August? Maybe you mentioned fertilizer there. That's the other tendency we see. We see fertilizer going out maybe at deadline in September for. Should we be looking at putting out a bit in the end of August, a bit more maybe as opposed to September? And even for farms with good growth rates, is there still a chance here to maybe just ensure growth rates continue by applying at that stage?
Yeah, I suppose there is a bit of a risk maybe at the moment because growth rates have been so strong in general. People probably weren't as quick to maybe keep the fertilizer levels up, and that was fine. If we can get away with spreading less fertilizer, that's absolutely what we'll do. But we have to bear in mind that the plant needs a certain amount over time. So if people have maybe skipped an application or whatever, there might be a lot of grass on the farm at the moment, but once that's grazed off, the plant could be very hungry, and we could see a sharp decline in growth rates. So it's about maybe obviously getting the balance between, if you have a lot of very heavy covers, you don't want to be putting out very heavy applications out and driving that situation even worse. But it's about trying to put a plan in place now to get through the heaviest of the covers, get them grazed off, and get fertilizer back on them that's going to grow your grass for the autumn and early winter period.
You're going to go into there, I suppose, but you're trying to build really from now onward. So how much really should we have in front of us?
So in terms of days ahead, we're really looking at the minute. Mid-August, we're talking up to about 20 days, so 15 to 20 days ahead. As we move into later August and into September, that'll be increasing all the time up to about 25 to 30 days ahead as we get into September. And I suppose that peak cover then, you're talking about 30 to 40 days ahead as we get into early October. And we're continuously rationing that out then over the final rotation from about mid-October onwards, closing as we go a rotation of 40, 50 days maybe.
But in reality, a lot of what happens now over the next 3 weeks really sets us up for our closing plan.
Well, it sets us up in terms of, I suppose, if we can get the graze outs right, or as best as we can now, taking into ground conditions into account in that. But if we can do as good of a job as we can now, it will make it a lot easier to graze those out properly over the next 2 rotations, which will set up quality for next spring. The fertilizer side of it, I suppose, is as I say, that we don't end up in a situation where the plant is depleted and we're not getting the growth rates as we go into the autumn to grow that grass for next spring. So on higher stocked farms, really between August and September, we're probably talking 30 to 40 units. So some really going out at the moment, and then some before the deadline. Lower stocked farms, you're probably, depending on what your demands are, number of lambs and that, you're probably talking 10 to 15 units now in August, and another 10 units maybe in September. I suppose the thing to remember about the fertilizer is that the earlier that it's applied, the better the response. So I think sometimes there's a temptation that everybody waits until the deadline and goes spreading. You will get a better response in August than you will in September. So you'll get more feed grown for the same amount of fertilizer applied. So it's going to be more efficient.
Is there now, will Phil, even in this stage year, going with a bit more compound maybe in that last round of fertilizer?
Yeah, so certainly this time of year is a very good time for applying K, potassium. So if you work with your nutrient management plan, if you've taken soil samples and done up a nutrient management plan with your advisor, pay particular attention to areas that need attention as regards K levels, and that can be applied now in the autumn. It's a good time to get it out. It can be working its way into the soil and is there available then for early grass production in the spring. And it is a less risky strategy than applying it in early spring when it can interact and cause issues around grass tetany.
Phil, thanks for your insights. Always good to catch up with you.
Thanks, Ciaran.
Grazing management at the moment certainly needs an active approach. We've seen a period of very high growth rates on farms, but it's also been challenging, particularly in terms of getting good utilisation. Whether it be in the form of removing surpluses early and getting them back into rotation, strip grazing ewes and lambs, or increasing group size where applicable. It's important we act now and make most of the grass that's available on farm. Again, where surplus have been removed, it should be done so early when conditions allow to get them back into that grazing rotation. Also important, as Phil outlined, to assess where land performance is at the moment and what the likely demand is going into the closing period, so we can put a plan in place to deal with this. You'll get regular updates on grass growth rates and dry matter around the country from Pasture Base. You'll also get an update on a weekly basis, along with any other updates on the sheep programme from our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. That's it for me for this episode. Again, you can listen back to previous episodes covering a variety of topics, and don't forget to subscribe to future episodes. I'm Ciaran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Hope you join us again soon.